For those of you who have attended our previous webinars, I apologize that you're going to need to hear this intro yet again. For everybody else and to those, welcome back for the final webinar in this series of Not Another COVID webinar this morning with Danny Godfrey of EG Technologies. Just to give you a little bit of background for those of you that aren't familiar, my name is Sam Cronin. I'm the Healthcare Innovation Manager at the UK Israel Tech Hub, a British government team operating out of the British Embassy in Israel that works with British multinationals to help identify their innovation needs and source solutions from the Israeli tech ecosystem. At a basic level, what we do is we work with British multinationals to help understand what are their innovation needs, what are the underlying business challenges they're facing, what's going to deliver the greatest ROI, and to find solutions here. We're active in a variety of sectors: healthcare, smart cities, mobility, fintech, insurtech. And in about 8 years, we built, I believe, 200 concrete partnerships between the UK and Israel, with a total deal value of about £100 million and estimated to impact the British economy to the tune of about £1 billion. Of course, in the healthcare sector, we can't ignore the UK's NHS, the National Healthcare Service, which is technically the largest healthcare provider in the world, responsible for about 65 million patients. And so, of course, a large part of this work is also about really trying to ensure that you, the entrepreneurs, have all of the tools and knowledge and access to the resources, such as Danny and EG Technologies, to help you on your journey to penetrating the UK as a market and scaling. And of course, the reason for running this webinar series specifically is we're all inundated and completely swamped and bored with COVID. And the fact of the matter is that healthcare is an incredibly slow game and everyone continues to innovate. And most people aren't pivoting towards COVID. Most people on an entrepreneurial journey in healthcare are probably a few years into a journey that never, of course, anticipated COVID, and continue on that journey, regardless of it. And so given that people are not traveling and not going, flying around and meeting new people and having the same level of introductions, we felt it was especially important to do what we can to ensure that people have access, again, to the knowledge and resources that they need. So without further ado, I will stop here and pass over to Danny, who will speak to you about product development, specifically in the medical device sector, and how that varies and differs from other tech sectors. Danny.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you everybody for logging in this morning. Speaking to you from an unusually hot and sunny United Kingdom. It could possibly even be Mediterranean. It's sort of 34 degrees outside and the sun's shining already, which is pretty amazing, pretty unusual. Just to catch up on some of the things that Sam mentioned there, we're very grateful that we're in the medical sector because, as he said, life goes on. Most medical development programs last for much longer than the length of what will hopefully be the length of the pandemic of 6 to 12 months or so. But we have found, just as an aside, and based on what he said a moment ago, that a lot of companies have been able to not pivot what they're doing to approach COVID, but maybe find a slightly different angle to what they're doing, largely in order to attract funding, which is being released as a result of COVID. So people, for example, who are developing interesting diagnostic platforms, their target may not have been COVID, but they're often adjusting their chemistry programs so that they can get funding from COVID programs to help speed them on their way, so they can then carry on, hopefully sort of boost it up a level or two by the time they get to by the time the pandemic is over. Anyway, but that's just an aside. So as Sam said, this is the fourth in the series of webinars, not another COVID webinar, organised by the UK Israel Tech Hub, and I'm going to be talking about, as he said, the differences between medical device development and development in other sectors. So think, product development, welcome to medical devices. I'll give a very quick introduction on me and therefore why I'm talking to you and the business that I run. And then we're going to talk about some of the similarities, because developing stuff in the medical sector isn't a completely different world, but importantly, some of the differences and some of the emphases which are different between a normal product development program and the things that they may be good practice everywhere, but you absolutely have to do them in the medical sector. And you not only have to do them, you have to be able to show that you have done them, because somebody will ask questions and they won't allow you to sell your device if you haven't done them. So very briefly, my background is as an engineer. I studied at the University of Cambridge, which is about a mile over there. You can't see it out of the window, but have to trust me on that one. I spent the first couple of years of my life in real industry, food and drink initially, and then in medical devices. And then I moved into the world of consultancy. From there, I moved, about 18 years ago, I set up my current business, EG Technology Limited, and we are a product development consultancy that works specifically. So I'm just trying to adjust something on my screen, which has got in the way. We work specifically in the we have a major focus on the medical device sector, developing products for other people. So we're based, as I said, in Cambridge, UK. We cover all of the engineering disciplines, but we also cover the other disciplines which are needed specifically in medical device development, and we'll come on to those in a moment. Perhaps the most important things to say at this point is that from the two of us who founded the business 18 years ago, we're now 35 people, and we have accreditation to ISO 13485, which is the internationally recognized quality management system for medical device development. It's heavily based on the ISO 9000 series of standards, which you may be more familiar with, but 13485 builds on those and adds some additional layers for specifically medical device development. So, in a medical device world, you need to move beyond what consumers want and what you can promise a consumer might want, and you have to be able to demonstrate that your device has safety and efficacy. So a medical product needs to be safe and it needs to be effective. It needs to do what you say it's going to do. Now, you can argue that that is the case for a consumer product as well. If you're designing a laptop or a smartphone, it needs to not explode. It needs to do what you say it's going to do. But the implications if it doesn't are that your sales may slump and you may need to go through a redevelopment cycle. In the medical sector, the implications if it doesn't is that you could kill somebody or that you could very seriously injure somebody. So you need to be able to demonstrate that you have minimized the risk to patients, minimize the risk to users, and for that matter, actually anybody else in the area. So if you think about the heart starting devices, you need to minimize the risk to the patient, you need to minimize the risk to the person who's holding the handles, but if anybody else in the room happens to be touching the metal bed frame, you need to minimize the risk to them too. And the safety side of things is very heavily governed by standards, much more so than in any other fields, with the possible exceptions of military aerospace and some aspects of automotive. But the efficacy is really important too, because a medical device has to do what you say it does, which means you have to be very careful about what you promise your device will do. If you say this device will cure cancer, you need to be able to demonstrate that it does cure cancer. If you claim that your device might help with the diagnosis of cancer, you have to be able to show that it does that, but that is clearly a much lower bar than saying it's going to cure it. And the other thing it needs to do is something which is worthwhile. A medical device which is completely safe but does nothing useful will still not be allowed to be sold. Your medical device needs to do something useful and it needs to do it safely. But of course, it's worth remembering that no medical device will ever be completely risk-free. Even the simplest thing, whether it's something to hoik your tongue out of the way so a doctor can look down your throat, poses the risk of cutting a tongue or being swallowed. Even a plaster, you can rip the hair off the back of your arm, and if you've got some weak skin, you can do yourself some damage. So no medical device is completely risk-free. So the results have to be worth the risks. And it's all about medical device development is all about balancing those two things. If you're looking to treat a minor ailment with something which requires a pretty hefty intervention, the chances are that the results won't be worth the risks. But if you're trying to intervene in something which has got very serious short-term consequences, but which might have longer-term, less serious consequences when you do the treatment, that will probably be viewed much more favorably. If you're saving a life, but possibly reducing the quality of life thereafter, that will be much more favorably looked on than if you're doing something which is really quite trivial, but might have similar consequences. So that's the big picture. You need to be developing devices which do what they say they're going to do, and they do it as safely as possible. The thing that is different here again in the medical sector, though, is you really have to be able to prove that you've done that. And the way that you can demonstrate that, the way that you can prove that, is to have control. You need to be in control of what you're doing, and that really comes from processes. So you need to be in control of your design process, and that's not just for your own benefit, and this is good practice in any product development. After all, it's a good idea to know what you're doing if you're developing a toy, let alone a medical device. But in the medical sector, you need to be able to show, because you will need to get somebody else to sign it off, that you have been in control of your process. So you need to have a very good idea of what you're trying to achieve. You need a good plan to get there. You need to monitor your progress against that plan, but you also need to be able to show that you have done so. And when you finally get to the end, you need to be able to prove that you've set out what you were originally trying to achieve. The reason that these things are important, again, to the level beyond the normal product development, is that for all but the most unserious medical devices, class 1 medical devices, which you can certify yourself, for anything which involves a greater degree of intervention in the patient or that potentially has more serious consequences, you need to be audited by an external independent body. And in the EU, those, and still the UK at the moment, those bodies are called notified bodies. They are independent companies that are authorized by their local government to check that you've done your job properly, to check that your results look realistic, to make sure that you've gone through all the different steps. And when you get an auditor in to look through all of the documentation which you put together, they need to build up a sense of confidence that you do know what you're doing. Doesn't mean that everything has to go perfectly, because of course that never happens. Things will always go wrong. But they need to have a sense that you are in control, and that when things go wrong, you have a calm and measured way of dealing with those things. This is a snapshot of our engineering processes at EG Technology. This is clearly very, very high level, but in general terms, all of our projects, whether they're in the medical space or not, start off with concept generation, coming up with all of the ideas. You do some feasibility studies to try to work out whether there's any chance of any of these ideas working. And then you go through a series, essentially, of iterations of design and prototype. So you start off with small scale prototypes that you can throw together quite quickly, hopefully learn a lot. You go to the next round of prototypes, beta prototypes, that will hopefully be closer to a final product, but they still won't work perfectly, and so on. It's an iteration process until you get something into manufacture. You do your compliance testing, and again, this is common across sectors. And then after the product's launched, there will be support, either to fix issues which come out when you've got thousands of things installed, or to continuously improve a product on the way through. So that will probably look familiar to anybody who's involved in new product development. At least we may have slightly different terminology, but the general trend should be familiar. But in the medical sector, it's not just a good idea to, but it is a requirement to do all of this stuff as well. So you need to be able to show that you have program management in place, along with formal design reviews and so on. You need to show that you have risk management in place. Again, every product development program, people will be thinking about what could go wrong. In the medical sector, you not only need to think about what could go wrong, you need to write it down, you need to score it so you get a sense of how serious it is. And then if it's too serious, you need to be able to mitigate that risk, demonstrate that you've mitigated it, rescored it until it goes below a certain threshold, so you can be confident that it's no longer a serious risk or an unacceptable risk, because as I said earlier on, the degree of seriousness will depend on what you're trying to treat. Similarly, every project, people should be thinking about who's going to be using the product, who the user is, but in the medical context, you have a legal requirement to consult with users at multiple stages through the development program. It's very important to have specifications written down as well, and so this is the general flavor of a project that we put together. And although 70% maybe of the time and the effort and the work, and therefore the money fundamentally, goes into that top level of stuff that I exposed first of all, the sort of the engineering work. The rest of it is equally important, if only to feed the engineering work reliably, and then also to satisfy the auditor at the end. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is to take a deep dive into two areas that we find people typically either don't understand or don't understand well enough. These are two areas that our clients very often haven't addressed, and therefore we have to help them address, and that's fine. We're obviously very happy to do so, but they're absolutely key to successful medical device development, and they are talking to users at the beginning of the process, and the importance of specifications. So before I go into either of those, have any questions yet arisen?
No questions yet, Danny. I'm monitoring it, but please, everyone, feel free to write your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll get them answered as soon as possible.
Okay, and that was the mystery voice of Rosette, who's my colleague at EG, who's monitoring the Q&A session during this webinar. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the stuff that you do at the beginning, why users are important, a bit about usability, and then we're going to talk a bit about specifications. So at the very, very early stage of a product development, somebody will have had an idea. And this is why a lot of people get into product development work. It's exciting. You might be about to spend the next few years of your life working on something which is really groundbreaking with cool tech. Maybe you'll get a promotion, become fabulously wealthy, save the world, depending on what your particular motivation is. And so if you're in new product development, the chances are that actually it's the beginning of this process which gets you excited. So before you get too carried away, it's really important, especially in the medical device sector, to remember that the idea comes right at the very beginning of the process that we've just talked our way through. We have seen, and we have been involved in, medical device programs which develop something and get them onto the market within a year, but that is lightning fast. That is really unusual, very, very quick, and to be honest, it's extremely stressful trying to do it as quickly as that. Just the notified body time at the moment, the waiting times can be nearly a year because of various changes to regulations which are going on at the moment, and COVID clearly hasn't helped that situation. So more typically, you're talking about a program of work which will be 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years to get certainly to get a new concept into the market. And if you're working on something which is truly groundbreaking, and an example might be gene sequencing technology, that's taken decades to get from the point that DNA is discovered, and then incremental scientific advances eventually get to the point where you can start to process individual genes on a machine in initially a week, and then a day, and then an hour. But that takes decades. So it's really important before you as an individual, and indeed the business that you're working for or setting up, spend too much time and commit to what might be a very long slog for a very long period of time, that you think about everything as broadly as you possibly can do at the outset. Cover all bases. To develop your idea, you're going to need technology. To develop technology, you'll almost certainly need a team. To direct them, you're going to need to understand your market, and to, I suppose, make sure the rules are being adhered to, you're going to need to make sure that you understand the regulatory framework that you're working in. Just as an aside, medical devices, I mentioned briefly earlier on, are essentially classified into 4 grades within the EU, and it's slightly different in the US, but broadly analogous. Class 1s are things that are very unlikely to do any damage. Class 2A and 2B are slightly different scales within things that could cause serious harm, and very crudely, class 3 devices are ones that if they go wrong, they could kill you. So a pacemaker would be a class 3 device. A toothbrush, actually I don't think a toothbrush is even classified anymore. A syringe is a class 2 device because it goes in your skin, and if somebody handles it poorly, they could give you a nasty injury, but it's vanishingly unlikely to do you very serious long-term harm. Okay, so these are some of the areas that you'll be thinking about, hopefully, and underpinning all of them is going to be finance. And of course, these things are all very, very heavily interrelated. You can't really start to have a conversation with a regulatory person until you have some concept of the technology that you're going to be developing and the market you're going to be serving. But you can't develop the technology too far until you know what the regulatory framework is. You can't develop your technology without a team in place, but you probably can't get a team in place until you've got finance. And you probably can't get finance until you've got a team in place. So these things are very, very complicatedly interrelated. To demonstrate to somebody that you are worthy of investment, you're going to need to make sure that you've got all of these bases covered at least to an extent. And so in reality, what you do is you form a core team of people who are probably happy to have done something for almost no money, so that you can demonstrate that, so that you can demonstrate to the finance team that you've got some credible people. And then you start to build it up in layers as you raise different rounds of finance. The one thing that's missing from this slide at the moment, and it's a thing that we find is very often missing when people first come to us with a brief for a new project, is the user. And I would argue that actually the user is probably the most important piece of all. So why should you care about users? Well, ideas usually come either from a technology idea or a market idea. And when they come from a market, it's called market pull. The market is trying to pull technology to fill a gap. So a clinician has had an idea for something that would make their life easier when they're doing an operation, for example. The user is looking for a technology to fulfill a need that they have. There's a real problem there. What we'll need to do is to frame that problem in a way that allows people to, engineers, to design something to meet that need. And that is market insight, really. That's an insight. In the opposite direction, sometimes you get technology push. So somebody has invented something which is potentially really, really interesting, really cool, and they're trying to find a home for that technology, possibly across multiple sectors. And we've had a case recently where a guy had invented quite an interesting way of generating power, heat energy, and actually he settled on ablating tissue in human beings as a way of cooking tumors. But he could have used it. Initially, it was going to be used in radio broadcasting. So this is a technology that's looking for a home, and eventually he found one. So in that case, a technology push is looking for a user need, and that person then needs to go around, or that company needs to go around, find somewhere that might be interested, and again, then develop a brief. And that's invention. Now, technology is covered by designers, engineers, software engineers, mechanical engineers, electronics engineers, user interface designers, and so on. And medical device companies are full of technologists, they're full of designers. But understanding the market is something that you really need users for, because as a designer, I sit in a nice air-conditioned office, fresh coffee machine, headset on, bank of 4 different screens. I can zone out and I can do my design work on my own, in my own environment. And I may think I understand what my user is going to need. But if my user is working in an accident and emergency department on 12-hour shifts, during which they will probably touch 50 different cases, 5 minutes each, quick decision here, quick decision there, I actually have absolutely no idea at all what it is going to feel like to be them. And so if I'm designing something for them to use, it's going to be really important for me to talk to them to find out as much as possible about what it is like to be in their situation. Users always want something that is better than what they've currently got. That is the motivation for innovation, really. There is a solution to this problem, but wouldn't it be nice if it were easier, it gave better clinical outcomes, it meant I could do more procedures because it's quicker to use, it's more comfortable. We're working on a project at the moment for a surgeon who is getting arthritis in their fingers because the procedure they have to do 3 times a day requires them to put a lot of force through their fingers, and he's had an idea of a way of reducing that strain. It could be more reliable, it could be something that saves money. All of these are very, very subjective ideas. What does easier mean? What does more reliable mean? Saves money, okay, I understand that, but how much is important? And this makes you wonder who the user actually is, because the most obvious one perhaps is the clinician. Most medical devices are used by nurses, surgeons, clinicians within a hospital or a primary care setting. Clinicians are probably most worried about things being easy to use and being comfortable to use, but of course they will also care about the other things on this list. Very often the user is a patient. It could be that the patient is literally given a device like an inhaler and they are the user in the sort of classical sense, but it could also be that they are lying on a hospital bed and they are therefore the user of that bed. Even if they're not moving it up and down, they are very much engaged with the bed, in which case they might be interested in it being more comfortable. And the other group of users who are often sort of forgotten about is the purchasing system within a healthcare system. And as I think one of the previous webinars talked about, certainly in the UK with the NHS, as Sam said, it's the largest healthcare system in the world. It's, I think, allegedly the 3rd largest employer in the world after the Chinese Army and the Indian Railways. It's a huge organization with about 1 million employees. And trying to navigate your way through the purchasing scheme is extremely difficult, especially if you don't understand about it at the beginning. So your user is likely to be made up from a little bit of all of these different people. Maybe before I come on to this, it looks like a couple of things have popped up on the screen. So I wondered again, Rosette, have any questions popped up?
Yes, Danny, there was a question from Roy Perlson about what kind of class is a measurement device, whether measuring heart rate or blood pressure that is non-invasive. What kind of class would that be? Would the Apple Watch, for example, be?
Okay, so yeah, that's a very good question, and actually the answer is that it depends, which is not very satisfying, I know. I should have said at the beginning that by medical devices, I'm sort of including what we would call in vitro diagnostic devices. So a medical device is something which touches the patient, typically in some form of invasive way. An in vitro diagnostic device is a device that typically doesn't touch a patient. So an Apple Watch is sort of somewhere in between those things. It doesn't penetrate the patient, but it sits on the patient. Actually, Apple Watches are not classified as medical devices at all. They're still consumer products. And that comes down to the claims, which is the thing that I mentioned a little bit earlier on. Apple don't claim to be able to measure any useful medical information about you, but they do tell you that they give you some information that you may be able to interpret in a way that is useful to you. So this is as legally particular as the case of if you get a set of glasses, glasses to wear to help you to see. A set of glasses is a medical device because it sits on the body and it impacts your ability it impacts the eye essentially. So it's correcting the eye, albeit in a temporary way. If you sell a glasses cleaning cloth, that cloth, just the thing that you get in the pack to allow you to clean the lenses, is an accessory to a medical device. But if you sell a lens cleaning cloth, which could be used for the lens of anything else, a camera, then it isn't classed as a medical device, but you may choose to use it to clean your glasses. So the regulatory framework can be surprisingly complicated. Not including wearables, more generally in diagnostic terms, they are classified again in a 1, 2, 3 sort of level, depending on the seriousness with which the information that they're going to give you will be used. So if something is trying to tell you whether or not you should be giving somebody a belt with those pads on your heart, that would be a class 3 diagnostic, because if you get it wrong, you could kill somebody. So I know that doesn't answer the question directly, but I hope that at least gives some pointers, if nothing else. Was there anything else, Rosette?
No.
Okay, I'll move on then. So I'm just going to talk very quickly about usability and what that means compared with usability, which is obviously deliberately slightly obtuse. Usability is a word that normal human beings use as they're talking about their new smartphone being, it's really usable, it's great, it's very intuitive, it's comfortable, it makes me feel good, it's a great product. That's really user experience, and user experience is very important, but in the medical context, the word usability specifically refers to something which is inherently safe by design. So it is kind of so usable in the consumer context that it's very difficult to misuse it. So when you design a medical device, you need to consider not just who your user is and how they're going to use it, but how they could misuse it. There are lots of cases from the history of medical devices of people who have reached out in a rush for the red button on the side of a device, thinking that was the emergency stop, it was going to kill all the power, only to find out that actually it was the give 2 kilovolts to the patient, and as a result have killed people. So when you're designing your device, as well as thinking about the user experience, what you might as a consumer regard as usability, it's very important that you look at the medical usability as well. And it's so important that there's a standard that covers it. And you have to be able to demonstrate to your auditor that you have gone through the various steps of ISO 63266. So part of that is finding users, asking them questions, and using those to start to form your specification. You can see now why I chose these 2 subjects, because they sort of one flows into the other one. So just very quickly, it's really important that you do talk to users, and finding them can feel like it's going to be a little bit of a nightmare, but there are 3 routes that we typically find people use to find their users, and these are the routes that we use ourselves if we're asked to find users on behalf of somebody else. The best one, if it's at all possible, is to use your personal network. It's quite surprising how often you, maybe a relative, maybe a good friend, will know somebody who is remarkably close to the field that you're looking at. It might be a friend who's had a particular medical condition, which means that they've met a clinician and they got on well with them. Maybe not to the point they're having drinks in the evening, but to the point that they would feel happy to introduce you. It may be a colleague of yours, it may be a contact of a colleague. If you can find somebody that you can get a personal introduction to, either directly or through a friend or through a friend of a friend, then you will often find that's the best route to finding somebody to talk to. People are usually very keen to tell you about what they do, very keen to tell you about what's wrong with the way they do things at the moment. And if you have that personal introduction, you're more likely to be able to get that an initial sort of soft approach. It won't cost any money. You might have to buy them a cup of coffee, but you know, that's all. If that doesn't work, then you can try a direct approach. Sometimes you can find out keynote speakers from conferences in the area that you're looking at, and you can approach them directly. Other key opinion leaders, people who write articles. You may find nurses or clinicians are advertised actually on the website of a particular hospital. Patient groups are a really good way of getting access, obviously, to patients, but also through them very often to clinicians. Every condition known to mankind has a patient support group these days, and they will very often be extremely keen to encourage people who are innovating in the space to reduce the suffering of their members. And there are quite a lot of medical charities which fit into a slightly similar category. If neither of those work, then there are also agencies, and there are agencies across the UK, and I know across the world, who can put people in contact with specialists in the particular field. In fact, they can also arrange interviews, and if you really want them to, they can also conduct interviews on your behalf. This costs more money, but they will have a network of contacts on their books already, so it can be very efficient in terms of timescale. So if you're in a real rush, that can be the best way to do it. What we typically suggest is that initially you talk to a relatively small number, but still a meaningful number of users, somewhere 6, 8, maybe 10, if you can find them easily enough. The most important thing is that you don't interview 6 47-year-old white males working in the same hospital in the same country, because there's a reasonable chance they'll all give you the same answer, and that isn't what you want. At the very early stages of a medical device program, the information that you gain is going to potentially completely change the direction of your development program. So you need to make sure that you're going to be appealing to the broadest possible market. So we would typically, if we're looking to talk to 8 users, expect them to come from at least 4 different sites. If the main market is in the UK, they can all be from the UK. If it isn't, then you'd want them in different regions. Ideally, you'd have people of different seniorities and also different roles. So you may have somebody who is going to be setting up the equipment and somebody who's then going to be using it, and a patient or 2 along the way. So try to get a broader spread as possible, so that you can get as wide a range of inputs as possible. When you finally meet them, a couple of very quick tips. Obvious, really. Be friendly and professional. It's really important to prepare. It's really important that you know what you're going to ask and that you know enough about the area beforehand that you don't come across as a complete numpty. You don't come across as somebody who really doesn't know what they're talking about. There's nothing wrong with going off piste if something interesting comes up, but on the whole, you should try to ask essentially the same questions of everybody so that you can compare the results that you get. As much as possible, ask open questions so that you're getting what people really believe rather than what they might think you want to hear. This can be particularly difficult. It's very easy to ask a question unintentionally, but to ask a question in a way that is likely to lead you to the answer that you want to hear. But if it's not the right answer, then you're kidding yourself. And again, as much as possible, try to find out the big picture. Where's it going to be used? Who's it going to be used by? Where does it fit in what's called the care pathway? Whereabouts between the diagnosis and the treatment does your device sit? Okay, so just to wrap up the user bit, we're going to talk through a couple of examples. The first one is something a project that one of my colleagues was involved in before he joined us. This is from about 16 or 17 years ago now, maybe 15 years ago. The product that you can see there on the screen is a device which controls, slightly increases the pressure and humidity of air for people who struggle to breathe on their own reliably, especially at night time. It's used at home. It's typically used by elderly people, and as you can see, the design looks pretty tired. It looks very medical, and people didn't really enjoy using it very much. So the product development team got very excited and they designed this. It does basically exactly the same thing, got a few more additional features, and they launched it with great pride, expecting it to completely take the market by storm. But in fact, it completely bombed, and people started buying the old one instead of the new one. At this point, they got some experts involved, and Nick now thankfully works for us, so we're able to leverage his expertise. And the first thing they did was to go to the users and ask them what was going on, ask them, you know, what they liked about the old one, what they liked about the new one, didn't like about the new one, and what they really wanted from the product. And what they found out was that, on the whole, people were ashamed to have something which looked so much like a medical device lying around in their house. Although it's often used at night time, sometimes this can be used during the day as well. And they were finding friends, family, grandchildren were coming around, seeing this thing on the side, and, you know, grandchildren saying, "Oh, I can tell my grandmother's feeling ill again. How are you?" And actually, people didn't want that. They didn't want that level of sympathy. They also found that the new version was much more complicated looking than the old one. There wasn't just a go button. There were lots of menus and options and stuff. And most people wanted it to do the same thing every time. So having regained their insight and their mojo, they set off again on the development program. And the product they launched was the one on the right. This does everything the one in the middle does, but it looks essentially like an iPad dock or an iPhone dock or a piece of stereo equipment. So when people walk into the house now and they see this, they don't even bat an eyelid. They don't think, "Oh, grandmother's ill again." They don't even notice it, actually. And that's ironically the greatest compliment that the product designer in this case can have, is that people don't even notice it. It just works, it fits into place, and it doesn't look medical. That was what the users wanted, but in this case, the company had to go through 2 whole rounds of product development and certification before they got the right answer. And the second example, which is one of our own projects, which we did a couple of years ago, was when a client who'd got a really clever way of detecting something from a blood sample for use in accident and emergency departments. It was an early indication of whether somebody had had a mild heart attack. They came to us and asked us to develop them a handheld device to run this new test that they developed. That's just a stock photo of a handheld device. That wasn't what they came to us with. Thankfully, we were able to persuade them that the first thing we should do would be to talk to some users. So we set up a list of questions we prepared, as I sort of talked through briefly earlier on. And to cover this particular aspect, the question was, what are your thoughts on small handheld point of care devices? So something very inoffensive and open, something that wouldn't guide somebody down one particular pathway. Much to our surprise, the feedback was very negative. You know, they get lost. I put them on the bed, the patient moves, it gets covered by a flap of a blanket. I'll never find the thing again. Or somebody said, if it's small enough, somebody will put it in their bag and they'll walk off with it. If it's battery controlled, oh, I'm going to need to find a flipping charger, or I'm going to need to, where do I get AA batteries from in a hospital environment? Do you know what? I don't need to run this test by the patient. I can get the blood sample and run it somewhere else. Why would I want to take the device to the patient? I'll take the blood sample somewhere else and do it somewhere more secure. So the insight that you get from that is that a desk-based device is more suitable than a handheld for this context within an accident and emergency department, ER. So the user need, therefore, is that the device should be desk-based, not handheld. And you can then turn that into a set of requirements, product requirements, such as those listed there. Those are sort of more measurable things. And the device we ended up designing for them is the one that's shown on the right-hand side. It weighs just over 5 kilos, so somebody can't just pick it up and pop it in a coat pocket, and it is nowhere near desk-based. But the benefit of doing it that way, as well as giving the users what they wanted, was that actually, because we didn't have to cram so much stuff into a handheld device, the development program was cheaper and quicker. So when you engage with users at the outset, you have the best possible chance of finding out what is really required of the thing that you're designing. And you can then turn those insights that you get from the user into a proper specification, which is what we're going to come on to now. But just before we do, again, Rosette, are there any questions?
There was a question about the NHS and whether to introduce a product to the NHS, whether it needs to save money and be therapeutic at the same time. But Sam responded to that. It needs to obviously also outperform the state of the art that's currently being used. So
I think in general that's true. I think that the NHS is notoriously difficult to sell into because it's sort of one huge organisation, but actually there are lots of different containers within that who buy things separately. So you don't just sell a device to the NHS, you sell it to sort of a region's NHS, and they look at what other people are buying, but it's not quite as straightforward as that. Finance is always going to be a motivator. Risk is going to be a big motivator. The inertia, the medical sector is extremely conservative. And if you're the person who's lying on the slab about to have something sharp stuck in you, it's reassuring to know that somebody's done exactly the same thing with exactly the same piece of kit before. But there needs to be a clear clinical benefit and almost always a cost benefit. If the clinical benefit, usually a clinical benefit that costs more to implement will save further money down the line. So overall, I think there needs to be a cost saving. Yeah. Okay, so I'll move on to the specification bit. And I think I'll probably have to rattle through this because that's taken me perhaps a little bit longer than I was expecting it to. A lot of people come to us and ask why they should write a specification. These are the hardest conversations that we have with clients, because we usually have to essentially say, if you don't write a specification, then you'll have to pay us to write your specification, or you'll have to find somebody else to develop your product. And that can seem like a rather assertive way of starting a business relationship. But why are specifications so important? Well, a spec is basically a way of writing down everything that matters about what it is that you're trying to design. As you start to write stuff down, you ask yourself more questions about it. So how much power is this thing going to need? Okay, fair enough. Maybe it could be battery powered. Okay, if it's battery powered, do I want the user to be able to change the batteries? Do I want it to be rechargeable? How long does it need to last from a charge? As you start to get into some areas, a lot of other questions ping up, and that is very useful in terms of actually forcing you to write down the stuff that is probably in your brain anyway, but that you might not have thought to write down, and most importantly, share with other people. Because when you write down a specification, when you write down the instruction set, the definition of what it is that you're trying to make, you can share it with other people from a very wide range of stakeholders, whether they are users, manufacturers, investors, advisors, the technical team, all different stakeholders. Once you've got it nailed down, you can give your development team, as said, essentially the instructions: go make me one of these. Now, if you give somebody a brief verbally, give that to 100 different people, you will definitely get 100 different products back. If you have a specification and you give it to 100 different people, there'll be variation, of course, in the way that people approach the problem, but you are much more likely to get a coherent set of things back, which all meet, or at least get very close to meeting what you're looking to do. And again, very critically, in the medical context, if you've written down what you're trying to achieve, then you can test against it, and you can demonstrate, you can prove to your notified body that you have achieved what you set out to achieve. And that is why the specification is actually the absolute bedrock of a medical device program. We usually start off with what we call a user requirement spec. I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. That's the, in the case we talked through earlier on, that's the, I'd like it to sit on a desk, don't want it to be handheld. The product requirements is a more technical document. The design specification is drawings and assembly instructions. That's the real detailed nitty gritty. And then the test spec is what allows you to show that you've done what you said you were going to do. So user requirement specification, generally very non-technical, but explains in a user's language, the sort of language they might use if they were talking to a colleague in a cafe about the product, what they want, not what it should look like, not how big it should be necessarily, certainly not anything about the technology, but as a user, I want the product to give me a result in less than 15 minutes, because otherwise I'm on to my next appointment and I've missed the opportunity, for example. And when you test against user requirement specification, you can find out whether you've made the right product. In contrast, a product requirement specification is much more technical. That's describing functional performance. So you've got numbers here. You're talking about weights, heights, speeds, volumes, times, tolerances around time. Something needs to take 5 minutes, but between 4 minutes 30 and 5 minutes 30 is fine. So much more engineering detail. It still won't say how it's going to do it, but it will describe stuff in a measurable way that you can give to an engineering team and say, I'm going to test that it does this in between 4 minutes 30 and 5 minutes 30, because the specification says it needs to do it between that time scale. So in this case, it's functional and performance targets, and the question is, did we make the product right? Did we make the product that we said we were going to make, rather than did we make the right product? Because there are two different levels of risk there. So as an example, this is a different project in which actually handheld was the appropriate thing. This is a piece of physiotherapy treatment equipment, and the user requirement was it needs to be suitable for handheld operation. That was translated into a product requirement that, in this case, we're talking about the hand piece here. You can possibly see there's something which looks a bit like a shower head on the side there, which is used to treat the patient. You give it actual numbers, it can't be any bigger than this, it can't weigh any more than that. The cable that attaches it needs to be at least 1.5 meters so that I can reach the patient, but if it's any longer than 2 meters, I'll get it caught around my chair or whatever it is. So you're moving from a fairly soft, needs to be suitable for handheld operation, and then you're trying to define what that means in terms that an engineer can measure. So differences there between the kind of topics which are covered. And again, these aren't just good practice. We would recommend that any person developing any product in any sector would write a suite of specifications, but it's actually required by regulations. So the medical device regulation, which is the thing which is coming in, it's been delayed a little bit by COVID, but it's the thing which is coming in to regulate all medical devices within the EU again. Devices shall achieve the performance intended. So you need to write down the performance that is intended. They shall be safe and effective. We talked about that earlier on. Balancing risks against the benefits. So these quotes on the left-hand side there are directly from the medical device regulation. And this is pertinent. It sort of reflects on something called the V model, which you might be familiar with, where you start off with the user requirements specification. What does the user need the thing to do? And even if the user doesn't know, what other stuff can you as an engineering team make sure it is a user requirement? For example, regulatory standards. It's unlikely that a clinician is going to know the names of the various standards which need to be in place. So you have to combine those things together. You then turn that into your product requirement specification, which is all about functional performance, regulatory requirements, risk management. You go through the design process, you verify the product. Did you design the product right? So that is testing the functional performance against the numerical stuff that you wrote down. Must weigh more than 5 kilos, must weigh less than 15 kilos. That's easy to measure. You can write down the test for that at the beginning. And then the validation is, does it therefore meet the user requirements? So in both directions here, we're finding out what the users say they need. We are trying to interpret it into engineering speak. And there's a risk associated with that, of course, because you might translate those user requirements incorrectly. You then design the product to meet the requirements that you wrote down. And at that point, you find out whether actually it genuinely meets the user requirements. Of course, you talk to users throughout this process. So you should revisit after the initial conversation. And at the end, you need to, this validation process, usability is a big part of the validation process as well. And just to be clear, it's not exactly the same, but this fits with what's required for the FDA as well. Some of the words are a little bit different, but as you can see, it's physical performance requirements, needs of the user, design outputs meet the design input requirements. So it's very similar, if not identical language. Specifications evolve. You don't start at the project and write down everything and get it right. The more you think about a problem, the more you learn from your prototyping, the more layers and the more realistic your specifications can become. But you need to start with something and move through things so you get to the point that before you start really in detail engineering development, which is the detailed design and development process leading up to beta prototypes shown here, you need to have a very detailed product requirement based on a very refined user requirement, so that when you get to the end, you can measure back and make sure you've done everything properly. We'll share the slides. I'm not going to go through everything on here, but I'm sure you can get the overall concept that you start off with basic notes and you essentially get more formal as you go through the development process. And at the end, if somebody says, do you know what, I'd like it to be 6 kilos instead of 5 kilos, you need to justify that, and you need to actually write a document which says we have changed the requirement from 5 kilos to 6 kilos because we think this is minimum risk, because the benefits are, and so on. Just a few top tips on writing specifications. Be as clear as you can and specific as you can be. It's very easy to write something which can be interpreted in 2 different ways. Try to make it as clear as possible. Make it measurable, because if you say must look nice, that's entirely subjective, and it's very difficult to justify. If you say must weigh between 5 and 10 kilos, it's very straightforward. You can put it on a set of scales and you can confirm that. Each point in a spec should just cover one thing. Otherwise, you can end up with half meeting a requirement, but not entirely. So it becomes a fail, even if you actually half succeeded. Make sure you're consistent with the way that you express things. We use shall, should, and may as things that must be done. It would be nice if they were done and can be done. Don't really mind either way. Try to avoid jargon, or at least explain jargon. And then it's all about this traceability that we talked about earlier on, going up through the back through that V model, so that you can go back across and make sure that you've done everything properly. It's really important that you write your spec from the perspective of the end product as well, rather than the prototype you're about to build. You might want a separate spec for that, but you need to have your eyes on the prize at all times. So I'm gonna finish there. We've talked about some of the things that I think are really important, and I think are very different between medical device development and others, at least in terms of the formality with which you need to do it. I would encourage you all, if you haven't already done so, to make sure that you communicate with users at the earliest possible opportunity, and to write down what it is that you're looking to achieve. If only so that you can find out that you've got there at the end, but it's also useful for contractual reasons and all sorts of other benefits as well. Okay, I'm going to stop talking there. That allows 5 minutes, I think, for any other questions.
Danny, we have a question from Kevin Flanagan. He said, does that mean trials health economics models to prove that? I don't know, Kevin, if you can give some more context to which part of the presentation you were referring your question to.
I'm not sure if I guess you can type, can't you?
Yeah.
That may be perhaps to the earlier question about demonstrating viability, but before getting into the NHS. Something's pinged up, I think,
yes.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
Okay. Yes, basically, health economics modelling is a really important thing to do. You need to. There are lots of specialists who do that as agencies, and you can employ people to do your health economic models. They will need insight into the particular healthcare system that you're going to be looking at, because the system in the States, which is obviously an insurance-based model, is very different to the system in the UK, which in turn is different from the system in Germany and France, and I'm sure Israel as well. But having a sense of the whole picture. So it's not just about swapping one box of plasters for another box of plasters. It's about the amount of time in operating theatres. It's about the number of consultations. It's about the number of times somebody may need to come back because at the moment it goes wrong 20%. This device is going to make that only 5%. So a thorough health economics model is that's not actually, it's not a regulatory requirement, but it's a requirement really if you're going to have any chance of selling into a healthcare system. Anything else?
No, those were the questions. I don't know if anyone else has anything.
Danny, I'd like to add something. You were telling this when you showed earlier the device that looked like the iPod dock.
Yeah.
I've got a story that relates to that. About 2 years ago, I was in the UK, very much exploring the aging space within healthcare, and I spent the week in London meeting with healthcare stakeholders in this space, providers, charities, everyone, VCs, companies, whoever. And this goes back to the point of how important it is to communicate with your users. I learned the most fascinating thing that week. Old people care about style.
They do.
Now the moment I understood it, it made perfect sense. But until that point, you just don't think about it. And you understand, these pendants, these big chunky gray necklaces with the red buttons press if you fall in, and no one's grandmother wears it. And the reason she doesn't wear it is because it's ugly. They don't want a white rail in the bathroom. They want something, if you need a rail in the bathroom, they want something sleek and designed. They care about style. And I came back to Israel and started communicating this. And I was sat in the pub, having just come back with a bunch of people from the sector, and I was telling them this story. And one guy looked at me and said it in this tone, so much so that I thought he was being sarcastic. He said, old people care about style? And it's exactly what you've just said.
Yeah, no, it's really important. Actually, as an anecdote from the non-medical space, in the UK, there's a brand called Good Grips who do kitchen utensils which have got good grips. So if you've picked up measuring jugs, those Pyrex measuring jugs, which are slightly slippery, and if you've got wet hands, they're quite hard, they're quite heavy as well. They started to develop a range of products which were specifically intended at, older cooks. So they did a plastic measuring jug. You didn't have to look down the side. You didn't have to move to look at the side. You could read the scale from above. It was lighter weight, and it had a really nice chunky grippy handle on it. And to their astonishment, and they did the same for tin openers and a range of other things. And to their astonishment, they ended up flying off the shelves because they realized that if they designed something that was usable for people who maybe were a little bit arthritic, who didn't have such great mobility, actually it was easy for everybody to use as well. And they suddenly found that loads of people in their 20s and 30s were buying these because they were just better products because they'd thought about it properly.
I've got a fair number of OXO Good Grips items in my kitchen.
There you are, you see, quod erat demonstrandum. We did not collude on that question or example before this webinar.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have any final questions? If not, we will send round later the slides and the recording to this webinar, along with a feedback form. It's always great for us to really understand how useful people found these webinars, how on point it was, if there was too much detail, too little detail. Danny, thank you very much. This was very, very interesting. Thank you very much for taking the time, along with Rosette and Lois for coming along. I'll also include, of course, Danny's contact details in the email that we'll send out, so feel free to approach Danny and EG Technologies. Everyone else, thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
Take care, look after yourselves, enjoy the heat, whichever country you're in, and it's very rare that I get to say that. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.